Coolidge was a Jeffersonian, but he wasn't that much of a Jeffersonian. Anyway, thank you very much, Coolidge. And I just want you to know tomorrow morning I'll be out in the lobby selling my jams and jellies as well, so we hope you'll come back. And by the way, I have to tell you, I've read Ralph's book, and it's wonderful. Highly recommended. 3 Virginians. Extraordinary chapter in American history and the history of the presidency, and illustrative of the dangers of putting too much confidence in what people profess to be their bedrock principles. I don't mean that cynically. The fact is that these 3 Virginians were neighbors. I mean, it was almost as if, imagine if a president from Grand Rapids was followed by a president from Ada, was followed by a president from Saugatuck. Actually, if you can get your arms around the concept of a president from Saugatuck, that might be kind of interesting. Anyway, they were neighbors in more ways than one. I mean, they were really, in effect, joined at the hip. These were 3 men who had shared the same historical experiences and in many ways the same philosophical gestation. They were all Jeffersonians, beginning with their namesake, and then, of course, Madison and Monroe. They were, in the modern, I suppose, lingo, they were strict constructionists. They had profound suspicion of big government and of executive overreaching. Remember, the American party system had been defined by Jefferson's disagreement with Hamilton over the nature of the American government, the nature of the American presidency, the agrarian versus the commercial outlook for America, and our relationship with France, revolutionary France versus England. So they're really, Jefferson is a defining figure, and Madison and Monroe have traditionally languished to some degree in his shadow, as they did even in his lifetime. But hopefully you'll agree by the time we're done that each of them is a little bit more interesting and more surprising than perhaps the textbooks have suggested. In one sense, at least, they were very contemporary figures. Many of you think of negative campaigning as a relatively recent innovation. Same thing with media bias. Well, think again. Both have been part of the American political scene since the earliest days of the Republic. To Thomas Jefferson, what he liked to call the Revolution of 1800 was nothing less than the rescue of popular government from aristocratic subversion. Such views have a melodramatic ring until one reads the wild predictions made by critics who denounced Jefferson as the infidel of Monticello. Consider the charges leveled by one Connecticut newspaper at the then Vice President of the United States. Should Jefferson defeat John Adams? It shrieked, quote, unrestrained by law or the fear of punishment, neighbors will become enemies of neighbors, brothers of brothers, fathers of sons, and sons of their fathers. Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will all be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. It wouldn't fit in a 30-second spot today, but you get the impression. Was Jefferson mentally prepared for such assaults? No man will ever bring out of the presidency the reputation which carries him into it, he once observed ruefully. That's just one of the shrewd and quotable observations which have helped to keep his memory green. The paradoxical Jefferson wrote and preserved for posterity thousands of letters while concealing his innermost self from prying contemporaries and inquisitive historians alike. More than a century ago, Henry Adams famously described the challenge that confronted anyone trying to understand Thomas Jefferson. Almost every other American statesman might be described in a parenthesis, wrote Adams. A few broad strokes of the brush would paint the portraits of all the early presidents, with this exception. But Jefferson could be painted only by touch, with a fine pencil, and the perfection of the likeness depended upon the shifting and uncertain flicker of its semi-transparent shadows. A very elusive figure indeed, and to our eyes, in many ways, a very contradictory one. He doesn't fit in any pigeonhole. There is no doubt he was an aristocrat who lived atop a mountain, and yet he considered himself a friend to man, and very much a man of the people. He once said he had seen no evidence that men's honesty increased with their riches. He was a great champion of free speech, who once remarked, "The man who fears no truths has nothing to fear from lies." This did not, however, mean that he was insensitive to the scandalous rumor-mongering that filled the gutter press of his day, and no small amount of which was directed at him. At one point, Jefferson declared the most truthful part of newspapers to be their advertisements. What's more, he said, the man who reads nothing at all is better educated than the man who reads nothing but newspapers. Well, then you have the fact that he shared the general distrust of early America toward political factions. "If I could not go to heaven but with a party," he once wrote, "I would not go there at all." And yet, he became, in effect, America's first political boss, with the help from Madison and Monroe. He was equally suspicious of political ambition. "Whenever a man has cast a longing eye on offices," said Jefferson, "a rottenness begins in his conduct." And yet he would, as we all know, fill numerous offices. He was trained in the law as a young man by the great Virginia lawyer George Wythe, and yet he had no illusions about that talkative profession. "Were we to act but in cases where no contrary opinion of a lawyer can be had," he said, "we should never act." And of course, he had fascinating, we think of Jefferson as a great liberator of the spirit, a man who is profoundly ahead of his time in the spaciousness of his vision about human possibility. When he talked about a natural aristocracy of talent and virtue, that was in many ways a radical viewpoint, demolishing heredity and primogeniture and all of these leftovers, if you will, from a royal or aristocratic society. He was, as we all know, a polymath. He was much more of a natural scientist than he was a political scientist. He was, in some ways, ahead of his time. He believed, for example, that the American Indian was intellectually the equal of the white man. He was very much a man of his time, on the other hand, in his attitudes about the African American and, in many ways, women. He enjoyed women, he enjoyed their company, but he tended to look upon them in many ways as ornaments to society, with one very important exception. What really mattered most, his own daughter. This is the regiment that he prescribed for Martha Jefferson: 8 to 10 o'clock every day, practicing music; 10 to 1 o'clock, dance one day, draw another; 1 to 2, draw on the day you dance, and write the letter the next; 3 to 4, read French; 4 to 5, exercise yourself in music till bedtime; read English, write, etc. In those days, before women pursued careers, let alone political careers of their own, Jefferson had his own reasons for urging such a rigorous schedule on Martha. Combining his gift for mathematics with his insight into human nature, the future president calculated the odds at 1 in 14 that his daughter would marry, in his words, a blockhead.